book, Realm of Ice and Snow, a story of triumph, tragedy, and history's greatest Arctic rescue. Buddy Levy, the author of Labyrinth of Ice and Empire of Ice and Snow.
Hi, this is Patsy with a Z. Welcome to Joy on Paper Live, a program for writers and those who dream of writing, and for everyone who wants to know the story behind the book. And I am so excited. I have the most wonderful guest today, Buddy Levy. I love his books. I've read them before. I think maybe all 9 of them. I'm so happy to welcome you here, Buddy. It is just great. I get books all the time, and I get excited. But when I got your book, this is like a dream come true book, because first of all, my husband was an aeronautical engineer. He loved anything to do with dirigibles. He loved anything to do with flying, and he loved anything about the North Pole. There's this wonderful book, His Majesty's Airship.
Yes, I have it.
I think we've listened to that like 20 times. So when I got Realm of Ice and Sky, Triumph, Tragedy, and History's Greatest Arctic Rescue. And then, on top of everything else, I discovered that you discovered somebody that really history hadn't written about. So it's like everything came together. It's a perfect mesh of all of these subjects that I'm interested in. I love thriller writers like Brad Meltzer, who, as a matter of fact, you worked very closely with. He's been on my program because I love his thriller books. I love cozy mysteries and I love memoirs, but the only thing that would surpass it would be a book about Napoleon. So
I'll get on it.
Okay, you get on it. You get on it. Wow.
Well, thanks for having me, Patsy. I really appreciate it. And thanks for reading my books. That's really excellent. And to hear about your husband. Yeah, the aeronautical engineering aspect. I'm a creative writing major, so that science was a little daunting for me, I have to admit. But I tried to work around it by quoting those who know about it and focusing on the storytelling.
I just want to show, of course, you are really an amazing author, but these 3 books particularly, which cover the same sort of subject, The Labyrinth of Ice, Empire of Ice and Stone, and now Realm of Ice and Sky. Of course, the sky is really great. And I must say, I think, unfortunately, if my husband had lived in those days, he would have been out there. He would have been.
You wouldn't have seen him for a few years. Yeah.
That's exactly it. I wouldn't have seen him for a few years. So, but this is exciting. And what I particularly found exciting, I want you to talk about this because it is so, when you're writing a book and then you come across a character who you could just grab onto to open your book with. So maybe we're going to talk about so many things. I get so excited about this. But let's start with Walter Wellman because he is so interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that. I didn't necessarily discover Walter Wellman. It turns out he was quite famous in his day, but I guess I have wrested him from obscurity in a way. There's only one standalone biography that I know about him, and then a few scholars who have devoted quite a bit of time to them. But most people on the street, if you ask them, have you ever heard of Walter Wellman? They would say no. And I have to admit that when I started researching this book, I had never heard of him, which is remarkable given that I've written, as you say, three books about Arctic exploration. But part of the reason is, so Walter Wellman was a guy who was born in 1858 in Ohio and was a self-taught young man who at 14 started his own newspaper in, I think it was the Sutton Times, and in Nebraska or something. And the guy just chipped away, worked really hard. And by the time we meet him in the early 1900s in Realm of Ice and Sky, he is a prominent journalist who is writing about all of the major movements in world news, actually. I mean, he wrote about the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. He covered presidential elections. He hobnobbed with Theodore Roosevelt, was actually friends with Roosevelt, and Roosevelt backed his Arctic exploration. And he had silent backers in J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie. So the guy was really well connected. But what I was drawn to was the fact that he also had this wandering, an Arctic dream. And he started following. He obviously knew all about the Franklin expeditions, and he decided he wanted to go to the Arctic himself and write about it. And so he made a couple of trips there in the late 1800s, right near the turn of the century, which taught him a lot. He broke his leg in a crevasse and nearly had to have it amputated, and spent the rest of his life with a limp and a cane. But at the same time, he noticed and had been writing about the burgeoning, fledgling airship and airplane industries. And so there's a lot of exciting things going on at the time. You've got the Wright brothers are beginning to fly their airplanes at Kitty Hawk, and hot air balloons are really in their heyday in France. And into this comes the airship and the earliest permutations of what we now sometimes refer to as a blimp, but they were called either airships or dirigibles. And Wellman has this epiphany. Actually, as early as 1893, he wrote that airships will solve the mystery of the North Pole and the polar seas, and it turns out he was right. So he decides he wants to strap is too loose a term, mount a 75 horsepower motor onto a 185-foot flammable hydrogen-filled dirigible and attempt to fly to the North Pole. And when I first read that, I thought, what could possibly go wrong?
Oh, everything about him I found so fascinating. And the wonderful thing, when you're writing nonfiction, you can always tell if a nonfiction writer is great if the story comes across as a novel. And in many ways, you are also a novelist, because whether you're describing the sky, but of course we know that you've been there, you know what it's like. It's not just something you've read about in Wikipedia. So we're going to talk about that. But well, you brought him to life. I love how you talked about he was married. I mentioned my husband would have gone away. Oh God, I can't even think about it. But I love that he had 5 daughters. I got such a kick out of it. And all their names started with R. I thought that was so cute. It's not just telling us facts, it's bringing us into the story. We're really interested in him. And you notice I have a plus sign there. And there's a reason I have a plus sign.
Yes.
Somebody else. So tell us, when you started researching him, he was already famous. He was well known. He had hundreds of newspaper articles. That's one of the ways that he managed to raise money. Did you get a kick out of finding, when you were doing the research on him, finding out about his personal life?
Well, I always think it's important and interesting to know that these figures that come down through history, they end up either being cliche in certain respects as heroic or villainous. And obviously, as human beings, they are complex, multifaceted, and they lived real lives, and sometimes they lived secret lives. And Wellman, of course, you mentioned leaving home and hearth. The other thing that's just always strikes me is the dedication that these explorers had, when you understand that, of course, especially in the earlier ship voyages, you say goodbye to your wife and family, and you're going to be gone 2 to 4 years potentially, and it's just such a commitment of time, and with a very real possibility that you're never going to see them again. As a family man myself, I'm always moved by these goodbyes where it really could mean goodbye in a final sense. But yeah, Wellman it's interesting. So you mentioned he has these daughters, but also he had an illegitimate son who he had with this very kind of mysterious woman who we don't know much about. And ultimately, he writes some cryptic, in the archives that I found, he writes some cryptic letters to his brother who understands what he's talking about. So Wellman doesn't give a lot of detail, but he basically suggests that he has taken out a life insurance policy and is going to keep the mother of one of his children, his illegitimate son, in fiscally solvent, and just put her up somewhere in Germany, but he doesn't really, we don't learn much more about her. That'd probably be another interesting tendril to go down, but I was so focused on the airships. But yeah, the reason I bring up these personal elements is because, again, these are complicated individuals with other lives, even, and then, of course, their commitment and drive to do these unprecedented expeditions takes them away from the domestic home life, and often for a very long time.
Exactly. And it's what I call as I said, it brings them to life. And as soon as you wrote that story, that part of the story, I cared about him. I wanted to know. I thought any guy who's going to get a life insurance policy for an illegitimate kid can't be all bad.
There's another way to look at that, though. But I understand what you mean.
It happened, but he was at least thoughtful enough, better than a lot of men. So I thought, I like this guy. And actually, you're right. People made fun of him. People made jokes about him. They didn't take him seriously. And I was surprised to see that they had these cartoons making fun of him.
Yeah.
So explain that. What happened? Where did they get this? You think about the press today, how the press can find all sorts of things to get on somebody. And here we're having, he was himself a newspaper person. But boy, oh boy, they did make fun of him, and they called him names, actually. They thought he was like taking advantage of things.
Yeah, there was a bit of that image right there. Is funny because that's after his Arctic explorations and his attempt to be the first to fly an airship across the Atlantic. And so one of the reason, there's some pettiness involved. He was a pretty easy target because he was so well known, and he was, unlike a number of the Arctic explorers of his time, Arctic exploration wasn't his primary gig. He was a very well-known journalist. And so there were criticisms, not only among the polar exploring community, but newspapers, and also some rival newspapers, because you've got to understand that Walter Wellman was supported and sponsored and backed by the paper he worked for, the Chicago Record-Herald. And you have, at the same time, the New York Times, the New York Herald, the New York Post, and they are interested in getting their own scoops and coverage. And Wellman had the wherewithal to understand. He actually set up the first wireless telegram stations in the Arctic and sent dispatches to Theodore Roosevelt. And so his grand plan was to not only fly an airship to the North Pole, but to then report on it in real time to anxiously eager awaiting audiences all over the world, scooped by his own paper that was sponsoring these events. And then other Arctic explorers, which I found pretty ironic, given the fact that all of them, Peary, Cook, Amundsen, and many others, they required stories in papers. They wrote books after their expeditions, and that was the way you recouped money that you had spent in putting together the expedition. So he was called a charlatan, a showman, an impresario, and all these things. And yes, he was those things, but I don't really criticize him for it. I think he was shrewd, and he understood that you need a bit of showmanship if you're going to be able to finance some of these endeavors. And I thought he was very clever. And he was also courageous. He's the one who hopped on an airship untested for the first time. And I will add, that's another reason that he was criticized, because he was always so behind in putting together these expeditions that by the time he got to Danes Island in northern Svalbard, he was unable to test these in Europe before, in Paris, before he flew. So they just called him a man with a death wish.
Before we get to some of the more serious explorers, I even here, this is so funny. They're still making fun of him, and and of course, this is a rival newspaper, but exactly that.
You could have easily put if you want to be mean-spirited, you could put a picture of an illustration of Sir John Franklin's fractured Erebus in terror and say, what happened to my ships, while they're cannibalizing each other on the shore. But it's, like I say, it's mean-spirited, and it also is unfair.
Yeah, I think it's unfair to him. I'm on his side. I like him.
Good,
I really
good.
like him. But of course, there are more people consider more serious explorers, ones who really, are very, very. And here's one of them.
Oh, yeah, he's serious.
He's serious, all right. Boy, oh boy. So tell us, people have heard about him, but we need to maybe start with him because he's the big guy.
So there's a lot going on in this book, including the advent of the airship, but also for many years, men, and it was then primarily men, had been attempting to make it to the North Pole by the traditional dog sled method, using teams of dogs and sleds. And Robert Peary devoted his life, an American Navy man who became synonymous with Arctic exploration, devoted his life to this singular quest of trying to make it to the North Pole. He spent time in Greenland and northern Canada as well, but yeah, that was his plan. And so his attempts are going on at the same time that Wellman is trying to fly an airship there, and you get this sort of race rivalry situation. But Peary is significant because he is associated with being the first to have made it to the North Pole. For decades and decades after all of the smoke clears in my book, but he ultimately is proven to have either fudged his records, excluded some records, or both. And so there's a real question, even in Wellman's time, whether or not Peary actually made it to the North Pole. But his claim of having made it to the North Pole ends up being really significant in having Wellman decide he's going to, after a couple of attempts by airship, move off of that, because it's now, in his mind, it's no longer in play. And then that's what prompts him to set his sights on trying to be the first to fly across the Atlantic in a dirigible.
Yeah, because even today, people, if you ask fairly educated people, so many people don't know who, I think everybody knows who the president is now, but but before this, nobody could tell you who the vice president was. They don't know when the Revolutionary War was, but if you find people who know anything about or have read, they'll always say Peary. They'll always say he's the one who got there first.
You've got polar nerds who know. I was at a Shackleton conference in Ireland in November, and these folks know everything about Arctic and Antarctic exploration, everything. They're a niche group, right? So the average person on the street, in fact, when people ask me, what are you writing about? And I say the Arctic, and they'll say, oh, like Shackleton. And I say Shackleton, except the other end of the globe. And it's funny because I think the reason is that Shackleton is a household name because his story is so lives. And I say, well, the difference and the Shackleton tale is that not everyone lives. And that's part of the fascination for me, is who's going to live and who's not.
And that's another aspect of a really great nonfiction book, is that you keep the reader turning the pages, because they don't know what's going to happen to everybody. So we don't know as we start the book. And I love that you started with Wellman, because I think that was a great way to start the book. I don't know if you played around how you were going to start the book, but that was great, because that immerses us immediately as a reader. You say, okay. And I think everybody will come across the same way. They like Wellman. There's something about him that he's trying. He's not.
Yeah, I'm glad you point that out, because history, a lot of the things that I read about him, in addition to the kind of teasing and fun making about him, he's considered like a failure. And I look at it a lot differently. You could look at the work of, think how many times Thomas Edison failed before he finally succeeded in an experiment. And so while Wellman didn't necessarily achieve his goal of flying to the North Pole, he pioneered the idea and the possibility, and then subsequent explorers with better technology followed in his path and were able to achieve it.
And for everyone who's ever been on a snowmobile, and I come from northern Michigan, I'm a Youper, and up there, everybody's got a snowmobile. Every household, I think, has at least 2 snowmobiles, because You're not going to go out there alone. He should have gotten a patent for that.
Oh man, yeah, you're bringing up these. He was really interested in technological advancement, and so when he realized that dogs had this real problem of having to feed them, so you have to carry you have to carry the food or kill the food along the way to feed them, and he thought when he started this airship notion, we'll bring these newfangled contraptions called gasoline dogs up there, and they were essentially like a giant lawnmower motor on a sled frame that had tracks. And so they really were the prototype of the modern snowmobile or snowcat, essentially. Now, again, they didn't work so well. They broke down, gas sputtered all over the ice, and they smoked and blew up. But he was willing to attempt things because he understood that the traditional method was like beating your head against an iceberg over and over again, and it wasn't working. So he understood that if you could get there in 2 days rather than 2 months, you had a serious advantage. And you would have to bring they carried enough food for the event of getting stuck on the ice. But he was an innovator for sure.
That's what I love about him, that he kept trying. He didn't always succeed, but boy, oh boy, he had to have a heck of a spirit. I could just, when I say that it reads like a novel, this section of the book, most of it, but this one, I could just run with this and write a film script for it. I would love.
Good idea.
I think it'd be great. Somebody should pick. They're going to option your stories, but I would, if I was in Hollywood, they come to you with a project. I was asked to adapt books for film, to do a script. Mm-hmm. And I had nothing to work with. It was just something horrible. Like, my gosh, please don't give me this book. I don't want. But boy, you just have to give me these first. I don't know how many chapters covering Wellman. I could sit and start a script. And I would follow that girlfriend of his all the way to Germany. Boy, oh boy, what right there. Hollywood, I love it. If you're listening to this interview, option Realm of Ice and Sky, just so you can write this Wellman story. Wouldn't it be fun?
Oh, yes. And a couple of my other books are under options. This one, I have to admit, it seems very cinematic to me. And I'm glad you brought that up about the storytelling aspect, because one of the challenges for me, and one of the real fun challenges, is that even though I know the story at the beginning, I do try to structure it in a way that the chapters have cliffhangers built in, and that because there's always enough drama within these stories that you don't have to manufacture it. It's there, but it's a matter of developing a good ear and sense of when is the right time to leave the reader, and how, without diminishing or diluting the story, how do you keep them wanting to turn the page and go on to the next chapter and have it unfold, like you say, as a novel, even though it happened. That's my goal. Exactly.
And of course, when you're dealing with explorers in the polar regions, you always have to wonder if they're going to get eaten by a polar bear or eaten by one of the companions. So you never know.
That's a great point.
So you keep turning the pages, which now brings us to our next explorer extraordinaire. And of course, he looks like it. Oh boy, he's got an attitude, this guy.
Amundsen's, Roald Amundsen's he's the GOAT in my opinion. He's a hero figure. Now, he's flawed too, just like all the others. And in his case, maybe even more. Very complex individual. Roald Amundsen was a Norwegian who grew up under the considerable shadow of a man named Fridtjof Nansen, who was a bit older than Amundsen and had gone to the farthest north and had done these amazing ship journeys in a ship that he designed with the very expert shipbuilders, that because all of the ships in those days would get crushed by the ice, or most of them that tried to go really far north. And Amundsen realized that if you change the configuration of the hull so that as the ice enclosed around you in the ship, it would squeeze it up onto the surface, and then you're just riding along on the polar ice in essentially a tilted sideways hotel, and you've got all the food and everything, and then you would strike out on dog sleds. Amundsen grew up at an early age, he determined he wanted to be an explorer after reading Sir John Franklin's expedition diaries and stuff. And he began sleeping with his window open, even in the darkest, coldest winters of Norwegian long winter, and hardened himself for a life as an explorer. And then he apprenticed on ships, became a captain. He was on a very famous voyage that is immortalized by a man named Julian Sancton, who wrote Madhouse at the End of the Earth. Great book. You should have him on. And Amundsen, by the time we meet him in the story, he is near the end of his career, and he has been the first through the Northwest Passage, the first to the South Pole, and the only thing left in his Arctic resume is to make it to the North Pole and be first there. Now, again, he gets eclipsed by Robert Peary, or so he thinks. And so this is what prompts him to pick up the idea of doing it in a different way. And so Amundsen decides first that he's going to try to fly there in an airplane. And along with this guy named Lincoln Ellsworth, an American entrepreneur, Lincoln Ellsworth, the dapper man on the left, he ends up committing $100,000 of his father's money, and his father, not so long after, dies and leaves him a lot more money. And Ellsworth finds Amundsen at a really low point in Amundsen's life where he's nearly bankrupt. He's on a dud of a lecture tour. His reputation is slipping, and he's becoming really insecure. And so he decides that he will take this young man's money and go with him to try to fly by airplane. And there's a couple of really fun chapters about this airplane flight, because as I mentioned, the airplane and the airship are being developed simultaneously, and it's not really clear which is going to be the supreme ruler of the skies at this time, right? Both have advantages and disadvantages. So they have a near-death experience on the ice in airplanes, crash landings, and spend about a month on floating ice. And they survive this ordeal. And at that point, Amundsen has to admit that Walter Wellman was right, and the airship is the way to go. And the airplane journey is in 1925, and the airship journey is really just a year later in 1926. And he and Ellsworth, and then they bring on board this Italian named Umberto Nobile, because that guy has the airship. And so this very stylish Umberto Nobile, he's an Italian airship designer, aeronautical engineer, professor of a university, and he's joined at the hip, literally and figuratively, almost always, with his little 12-pound terrier, Titina, who flies with him everywhere he goes. Titina is the most traveled terrier in the world. And so this guy agrees to sell the airship, which was called at the time the N1, but Amundsen insists it be called the Norge for Norway as part of their deal. And so the plan is that, and so these guys really, their flight in the Norge is an unmitigated success in every way, probably every way except their somewhat inglorious arrival in Alaska, because they have to make a emergency crash landing. But other than that, they have gone farther than anyone ever has in an airship. They've flown over the North Pole. They have determined that the North Pole is not a landmass, but is frozen polar ocean. And they are welcomed home to fanfare, ticker tape parades, thousands of screaming throngs. And then everything unravels, because Amundsen and Nobile have gigantic egos the size of their dirigibles, and each wants the spoils for their country and for their sponsors and for themselves. And it gets really bitter and ugly, and Amundsen writes this nasty book devoting 3/4 of it, or maybe a third, I can't remember exactly, a lot, to saying mean things about Nobile. And so this actually, from the standpoint of the book, though, I don't find their petty feudings that interesting, but what it prompts very interesting, because Nobile, at the end of all this, decides, the hell with Amundsen, I'm going to do this for Italy and I'm going to do it on my own. I don't need Roald Amundsen. At that point, Amundsen basically tells everybody he's retiring and says there are all the major global problems of geography have been solved, and I'll leave the smaller problems to younger men. And he would have just ridden off into history just like that had not the events of part 3 in the book transpired, which is that Nobile ends up getting the support of the Italian government once again. He has a new airship that is even more, it's very similar to the Norga, but it's got all the bells and whistles of the finest craft in its day. And this thing flies fast. Again, at this point, they're being able to go up to 75 miles an hour instead of only 50, and flies the thing all the way from Italy to Svalbard, and embarks on this journey where he has almost all Italian crew members, and the plan is just to do this and prove that the Italians are superior in design and navigation. And of course, it ends up becoming, it leads to the largest polar rescue in Arctic history, because they crash and no one knows where they are, and they've sent some cryptic, yeah, I'll just say they have sent some cryptic last messages before they went down. And so it leads to this international operation.
It's a mystery.
It's incredible.
Operation. It's incredible. Yeah. It is. It is fantastic. And I bet, I can guarantee you, I am probably the only one who's interviewing you who actually knew Umberto Nobile before they read the book. Because, as I said, my husband being an aeronautical engineer, and he had done a paper in university about Nobile.
Yeah.
So,
wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. So it's just so funny how these things happen. Sometimes things are, as we say in Yiddish, besher. You never know.
Yeah. You never know.
The connections. So let's go back and talk a little bit about, let's talk about the cold. As I said, I'm a Uber, and I was born in a blizzard, one of the worst blizzards that they ever had in northern Michigan. So it was so bad that the doctor landed up being stuck in our house. He had made it on snowshoes, but then he couldn't leave. So
wow.
But I don't like the cold. I'm in Austin. It was 22 degrees last week, and I was complaining. I can't take 22 degrees. So tell us some of your own personal experience. I know your dad was in the Olympics, and so you were involved in cold weather, but boy, oh boy, when was the first time that you actually got frozen?
Oh man, very young. We were 10 when we moved to Idaho, but even before that, I had been skiing a lot in California from the time I was about 5 in the Sierras and stuff. But once we moved to Idaho, winters are real up there, 6,000 feet elevation. It's interesting you brought up the UP. Sun Valley, Idaho is where Ernest Hemingway spent many years and ended his life there. And I went to Hemingway Elementary, and early as a boy, I had read all his stories about the Upper Peninsula in the Nick Adams stories and stuff. But I was drawn from an early age, even like my dad introduced me to Jack London's stories, and I can never forget To Build a Fire, that very elemental tale of either he's going to get this fire going or he's going to die. And I was probably 11 or something when I read that book, and I realized now that all of my stories, or the books that I gravitate toward, have a very similar theme. They're going to figure this out or they're going to die. And
it's funny you say that you read that at 11. I read that when I was 11. And that's
great.
One of the reasons I hate the cold.
Yeah. And so I spent a lot of time, I ski raced growing up. I still ski. I think I'm going on Friday. I love skiing. And I think the cold reminds you that you're alive, where you're so close to, you realize when it's really cold and it's just you and the elements, and if there's a fine thin line between keeping moving, keeping your core body warmth, or else something grim is going to happen soon. And there's something tantalizing to me about that. In addition, I just love I love the colors of cold places. I love the incredible sparkle and gleam and glisten of sun on new snow or on hard frozen snow. I love the feeling of super cold temperature against my skin and just the intensity of it. And then, you know,
No,
a lot of times
that I love, and the skies are so beautiful when it's really,
yeah,
really cold.
and a lot of times you're in mountain settings too that are just gorgeous.
But when you've gone, what's the furthest north you've gone? Where? What's the furthest?
For researching this book, so I went to the exact spot where they flew the airships from, to Kings Bay, Svalbard, and that is right near. It's at 79 degrees north. It's the furthest permanently inhabited town in the world, and I went there.
So what's the coldest temperature you were in?
And I have to say I went there in summer, but it was still at night. It was getting to about 30. The coldest I think I've ever been in is Silver Creek, Stanley, Idaho. Probably 40 to 50 below, I would say, with wind chill. Cold.
Yeah.
But I had a coat. I'll tell you one last thing. Like, I had a ski coach named Jim Severia, and I actually ran into him last summer. And I told him I carried this with me always. So he had this kind of reverse psychology approach. And we skied as young kids up on the mountain in Sun Valley, Bald Mountain, it's called, and we would ride the chairlift up there at 8 in the morning in some bitter, bitter cold, where the shady side of the mountain and you're riding a slow chairlift. They used to hand us these thick canvas outside and then fleece inside blankets, and we would huddle up under these things with little Zippo lighters to try to keep some heat in there. But when we would go skiing down the mountain and our toes are frozen and we were just absolutely shivering, and Jim Severia would cock his hat above his ears and he would, and dusty. And he always just thought, if you look at it the other way, like you think of it as in your head, it would work.
We used to ski a lot in Europe, but still my favorite part is getting to the chalet, getting to the hot chocolate and the fondue.
Yeah, some schnitzel.
Yeah. Oh, oh my goodness, yes. We always went to Austria. We found this one place in Austria that was still small enough, not overcrowded, but great runs. And in those days, my husband used to ski with his cowboy hat on, so it was really.
Oh, like Billy Kidd, yeah.
Yeah.
Steamboat Springs guy.
Yeah, that was before the days of stuff. So we had. I love the schnitzel. Why did you say that? Now I'm going to have to
get you started.
These people are amazing. Every one of them who did this exploring, you just have to admire them so very much.
I do, and their stories are timeless, and that's one of the things that keeps drawing me back to them. Though I have to say that having just finished my third Arctic book, my spouse she's like, why don't you write something that ends up in Tahiti or Bermuda, so we can go there to do the research? And I'm like, I did write a book about the first Europeans to descend the Amazon, so I like the rainforest and the jungle as well. But yeah, I might try to go somewhere for research a little warmer.
Yeah, these research trips are tax
Exactly.
deductible. So yeah, there's some really hot places that you can go to. But it's really, this book is so fantastic. Realm of Ice and Sky, and it's triumph, tragedy, and history's greatest Arctic rescue. It's an amazing book. Lovely covers. They do a beautiful job for you. The covers are fantastic.
Thank you so much, Patsy. I really appreciate you having me on, and can't wait to continue the conversation with you and your listeners on the next one.
Yeah, we won't wait till the next one. Let's go back
Sure.
and do one of the earlier books, okay?
Anything you want. Really
Okay.
appreciate it. You've got great energy, and this has been fun.
Okay, thank you so much. And this is your website, buddylevy.com, right? I will never forget you, both for your books and also because your name is Buddy, and my favorite cousin was Buddy, and that's a great name. A great name for a writer. Everybody remember this name. I will add one thing before you leave. I know you have to leave. I don't know if you have ever thought of this as a date book. This is what I call a perfect date book. All of you people out there looking for romance.
You think?
No, it is. Why? It's
I
perfect.
love that.
This is what I did with my husband. I found books that would appeal to me and would appeal to him. And if it had an RAF base in it, if it had anything to do with an air base,
Yeah.
I could read the book, he could read the book, and then we'd travel to those places. This is a perfect way for men and women to get together, and you're both reading the same book, and it really gives you a way to get to know each other. So I call it a date book.
Great idea. I like it.
Absolutely. I thank you so much. It's just been a thrill to talk to you.
My pleasure. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Bye-bye now. Bye.
Take care.
It was so much fun to talk to him. Look at this book. I've got it all marked up. I've put a mark on every page that I wanted to talk to him about. It is a wonderful book. Sometimes you get these books that just open your eyes. And nowadays, something like this is very relevant. We're talking about Greenland, and we're talking about all sorts of exciting adventures. And when you get this book, you understand that people are able to do amazing things. You will be really enthralled. It's absolutely a fun read. You'll just fall into the story and want to turn the pages and find out what happens, because interesting things happen to explorers. So get this book, Realm of Ice and Sky. It's available on Amazon, and it also has a audible version, a wonderful narration. Meanwhile, please subscribe to Joy on Paper Live. We really need subscribers so that I can bring you more interviews with fascinating authors. All you have to do is click that button, subscribe, comment, and share, and please join Joy on Paper Live. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.